Welcome to Ask Historians Aloud. In this special episode series, we'll be bringing you curated audio content. This series features questions and answers from our subreddit, provided by our amazing Flair panel. This is a way of casting light on the great questions and answers that are happening every day at Ask Historians. To learn more, or for even more content, follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Please also check out the Patreon, which goes towards supporting this endeavour. Welcome to Ask Historians Aloud. Today's episode will answer the question asked by Apollo Calm and answered by Hillsonghoods. This discussion was contributed in a fascinating thread comparing how cultures past and present conceptualize symptoms and diseases which we now understand as mental illness. Hillsonghoods wrote their discussion as one of several, and references another excellent answer by Ask Historians contributor Bentresh, who explored mental illness, religion, and ritual in late Bronze Age Anatolia. Links to the thread can be found in the podcast description. The following transcript has been lightly edited. Is the concept of mental illness a modern phenomenon? It all depends on what you mean by the concept of mental illness. Firstly, as Bentresh excellently points out, using Hittites as an example, people in the past noticed that others had a particular set of characteristics that went together, and which looked much like our modern conception of depression. But people notice depression-like symptoms is not quite what I would mean by the concept of mental illness. Instead, implicit in the idea of the concept of mental illness is the idea of a concept that there was a physiological, rather than a spiritual, explanation for these symptoms. Illnesses is a profoundly medical concept. In the Hittite example discussed by Bentresh elsewhere in this thread, the implicit explanation for the depression-like symptoms is spiritual, rather than physiological or medical. The solution, a magical ritual, is accordingly based on trying to please whatever gods the person may have offended, rather than on treating the depression as a physical symptom. So how far back do we get people treating mental illnesses in a medical kind of way? Well, ancient Greek and Roman physicians, Galen or Hippocrates, certainly also did discuss situations where people exhibited constellations of symptoms that resemble modern mental illnesses. Note my hesitation in calling these constellations of symptoms depression or PTSD outright, for reasons I elaborate on in another post. They had an implicitly physiological explanation for these constellations of symptoms, that there were four fluids circulating through the body, the humours, and that imbalances in these four fluids caused various personality characteristics and illnesses. One of these fluids, black bile, was responsible for depressive personalities and symptoms. This system of thought has been clearly influential on the English language. Many words that relate to personality and feelings, like humour, based on a Latin word for bodily fluids, melancholy, based on the Greek word for black bile, phlegmatic, sanguine, and bilious, ultimately come from these ancient Greek ideas. However, these ideas are still somewhat different from the modern concept of mental illness, I think. It's a little hard to tell how they interpreted these concepts in practice. They're talking about mental illnesses, but they're not quite talking about it as a broad concept the way we do now. The theory of humours implicitly attempts to explain what we might now call mood disorders, but there's no real explanation here for other illnesses, which modern psychologists might say involve disordered thoughts, such as schizophrenia. There's a long history, obviously, of people treating psychotic symptoms and the like not as mental illnesses, but instead as possession by demons, in profoundly religious ways rather than medical ways. This only really begins to change in the 19th century, as physicians become aware of how the brain worked, in terms of what some of its functions were and what it was made of. Additionally, it's only in the later 19th century that you get doctors like Kraepelin and Freud wrestling with the implications of Darwinian thought for understandings of how the mind works. One example of 19th century advances in the understanding of the brain that's still in every psychology textbook is the story of the French physician Paul Broca, finding a correlation between a brain injury in what's now called Broca's area and the victim's inability to say any word but tan, which clearly inspired George R.R. Martin's Hodor. This kind of research led to the late 19th century phenomenon of phrenology, where bumps on the skull were meant to be guides to the minds of the owners of those heads. But they also led to more sober thoughts, like the diagnosis of dementia praecox, the forerunner of schizophrenia, which was once again strongly associated with Emil Kraepelin. Krapelin's influential psychiatry textbook very specifically argued that such disorders were medical, related to neurophysiology. In terms of the specific phrase mental illness, the earliest two examples I can find on Google Ngrams are from 1824 and 1832. The phrase doesn't appear to be used before then. Insanity is much more common. Both examples, I suspect, are used euphemistically. In context, I suspect that those are authors who don't want to say insanity because of their respect for the powerful figures they're discussing. The 1824 example is from a book by Edward Newton about important politicians and the like called Public Characters, and he uses mental illnesses to describe the behaviour of George III, who died only 4 years prior. David Brewster's 1832 biography of Sir Isaac Newton speaks of Newton's supposed mental illness in a chapter heading, arguing that Newton's bizarre theological arguments actually weren't the result of old age dementia. Instead, the phrase mental illness only starts to occur in psychiatric or psychological technical literature in the 1930s. As far as I can tell, Freud never uses the term, and when it is used, it's used by psychiatrists who are discussing medical approaches to treatment. One early usage is by Samuel Broder in 1936, in a paper in American Journal of Psychiatry titled Sleep Induced by Sodium Amytil, an abridged method for use in mental illness. In the same year, an author in the British Journal of Psychiatry uses the term in a paper titled Melancholia, Prognostic Study and Case Material. However, usage of the term explodes in popularity in academic journals from the 1940s, with hundreds of uses of the term that I can find on Google Scholar. It seems likely to me that the term mental illness originally came into use in the 1930s as an antonym for mental health or mental hygiene. People talking about mental health or mental hygiene in the early 20th century mostly seemed to be making recommendations about how to achieve well-being and the good life. There was something of a movement here, made an analogy to the physical hygiene movements of the period. This seems grimly ironic to me, because mental health these days is a euphemism for mental illness. The American National Institute of Mental Health, of course, almost entirely researches mental illness.